welcome and thank you for everyone here tonight for joining us. This is a very special evening where we have a special guest for our community conversation with Sheryl Sculley. And why this is important to our community, you're going to learn all kinds of things because we have burning issues that will affect the future of Frisco. And what better way than to learn from people who have lived in these same environments, that have faced the challenges, and learn from great leaders so that we can bring that back home, educate our voters, so we can make really good decisions here for our community that's going to impact us literally for decades. But first, let me introduce our guest. So Sheryl Sculley is an award-winning city manager who is considered an authority on city management. She obtained a Bachelor of Science degree in political science and journalism from Ball State University, and she earned her Master of Public Administration degree from Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan. She also completed the executive programs for both local and state government from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Ms. Sculley gained national attention for dealing with unsustainable benefits for San Antonio's police and fire unions, and in doing so, steered the city away from a future financial crisis. During her tenure, San Antonio achieved a AAA bond rating and invested billions of dollars into critical infrastructure updates and additions. Prior to serving in San Antonio, Sculley was the assistant city manager in Phoenix and the city manager of Kalamazoo, Michigan. She is a life member of the International City Management Association and a fellow in the National Academy of Public Administration. After 45 years of public service, Sculley retired from city management in 2019 and now resides in Austin, Texas. And me listening to your book on the way to the Texas-Alabama game this year, fittingly, I learned that you had a daughter on the Palm Squad and are a UT fan. So officially, hook 'em, I knew I would like you. Welcome, our guest, Sheryl Sculley. So we'll just get started. So first and foremost, would love for you to share anything about yourself, why you got into city management to begin with, and what led you to San Antonio?
Well, actually, I did not intend to be a city manager, although I am the oldest of 7 children, and my siblings accuse me of trying to be the city manager of the family. I guess I kind of was, am. But I went to Ball State on a scholarship. After serving in Kalamazoo for 15 years, I was recruited to Phoenix as a deputy city manager, and then was promoted to the number 2 position shortly after arriving, and served there for 16 years, and it really catapulted my career. I was able to work on once-in-a-lifetime kinds of projects and issues and policies. Phoenix is the largest council manager city in the country. San Antonio is the 2nd largest. Dallas is 3rd. And so after working there, I thought I would stay until I could compete for the city manager's job. But in the meantime, San Antonio came knocking, and a recruiter contacted me and invited me there, and I wasn't really interested. However, my daughter was already a sophomore at the University of Texas, so I thought, well, she's just up the road an hour, and Colin, our son, was going to go to school in California. I don't have to stay in Phoenix, and my husband, who's followed me around the country, said, let's do it. So we did move there in 2005, and I served as city manager for 14 years. San Antonio has very short term limits. I know you've talked about some of that here as well. When I went to San Antonio, 2 2-year terms, and so it was a revolving door of council members. We did, after I was there about 4 years, go to the voters and changed it to 4 2-year terms. They have a charter commission now looking at 2 4-year terms. That's really the way it should go. The reason we couldn't do that back in 2008 was because a couple of council members had taken bribes, were carted off to prison before I got there. And so the community really didn't have confidence in the elected officials and wanted to be able to vote them out every 2 years. The consequence of that was that while I was city manager, I worked with 47 different elected officials in 14 years, including 4 mayors. And so it was a constant exercise in educating newly elected people on all of the big things going on. And San Antonio is a city of 1.5 million, a $3.5 billion annual budget, more than 13,000 employees, and we also owned the energy company. And as city manager, I had rate authority to make recommendations to council on their rates. They would present to us their recommendation, we would analyze that, negotiate, and so it was a big job.
Wow. Well, we share a parallel there because 17 years ago, I was first elected when I was 32 years old.
There you go.
And I share the sentiment. I was like, looking back, I was like, I had no idea what I was doing. But I'm glad the citizens saw some promise in me. But before we get into the title of the book, how would you describe the issue that the city was facing that led you to write the book?
Yeah. Well, let me say that when San Antonio recruited me, they were looking for an organizational turnaround. They wanted a city manager to come in and assess talent, get the financial house in order, develop big bond programs similar to what we had done in Phoenix. Some of you may know that Phoenix had, back in 1988, approved a $1 billion bond program. And think about that. I mean, it's a big city, but a new city, and yet they were still doing $1 billion bond programs back then. So I was recruited there in part to implement that $1 billion bond program, having grown up in the upper Midwest, what was called the Rust Belt at the time, where all I knew was cutback management. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven to be able to work on a $1 billion bond program and revenue that equaled inflation. So it was high growth and a great experience. But San Antonio was looking for an organizational turnaround, and I actually turned down the job the first time it was offered. And then a new mayor was elected. He is the retired Chief Justice of the Fourth Court of Appeals, had never been to a city council meeting, and but the community thought highly of him, and many community leaders asked him to run for office. They knew that we needed change, and he and Red McCombs, a name you know as a Longhorn, convinced me in the summer of 2005 to come to San Antonio. So I signed a 2-year contract thinking I'd stay for 2 years, help them out, and then I'd go back to Phoenix. But that didn't work out that way. They extended my contract 5 times, and I stayed there for a total of 14 years as city manager. But the work that we had to do was quite serious. About a third of the executive positions, I know several HR people are here today, and about a third of the executive leadership positions were vacant or had interim directors. There were a lot of problems inside the organization, and so I spent the early months talking with council members, the community, and then identifying the common threads of what needed to be done so that we could put together, and I presented the council a work plan for that first year as to what we would accomplish. One of the first people I hired was a police chief, William McManus. He's still police chief today, which is unusual for a major city, but doing well. So over time, I did replace all of the 40 department heads. Some people left on their own or retired, others I asked to leave. I promoted from within about half of the executive positions. The other half I recruited from elsewhere around the country. And I'm a strong believer in mixing it up, you know, having people come in with a fresh perspective and bringing new ideas. The best ideas are those borrowed from someone else doing it well and tailored to your own situation. So there was a lot of work to do in those early years before I got into working on remodeling the police and fire contracts. were spent really getting the house in order and working on the financials. I was there for 9 months before I even could get a financial statement out of the finance department, if you can imagine. So you think about the year 2006-07, the economy was still strong. I knew money was coming in, I just didn't know how much or how much we were spending. So I almost quit over that, but we stayed the course and got things straightened out, and then earned a AAA GEO bond rating, set a goal to become one of the best financially managed cities in the country. And I can't forget the goal setting session we had with the executives, and one of the staff from finance came up to me and said, "Are you sure that's something achievable for us?" And I said, "Why would we not strive to be the very best at what we do?" And so we held and still hold, San Antonio still holds a AAA GEO bond rating. And that enabled us then to take on big bond programs at very low interest rates. In fact, the last sale, while I was city manager, was at something like 2.3%, nearly free money, right? So you can put more money into production and actually get some things done. So I had a lot of work cut out for me when I went there, and we just tackled it, you know, had a long list and check it off the list and keep going, and work with the council and the community to make sure they're on board with what we're doing.
Very good. Well, then reading the book and some other articles, clearly you are well respected in the community and as a leader of the community. But I do want to now move into the title of the book. And I'll be honest, when it was recommended that I read the book, when I got the title, I was like, I don't know if I want to read the book. But you address it as the first thing in your book and why you titled it that. And part of the rationale is everything that we feel as leaders here in this community, which is we all love the individuals that serve our police and fire departments and that work and that are for our community, and are the brave men and women that run into burning buildings. You know, on our ballots here, it's just the fire that's looking for these propositions. It's not the police. But I'm the first to admit that I was the first candidate in Frisco's history that our fire and police associations ever endorsed. Back in 2007, I was their first endorsement. And I was really proud of that. But back then, their association was very different. It was, they were truly, you know, looking out for the safety of the community, their individual members, trying to do fundraising, trying to do really good things. They weren't really trying to influence policy from those positions. We've certainly seen that shift and change with new leadership in the association here over the last few years, where it has become very different. And I think almost every one of our council members that are currently serving at some point in their career was actually endorsed by the associations, but now that it's changed. So tell us about the title of the book.
Yeah, so I cannot take credit for my book's title. It was inspired by the police union president, who in one of his commercials that they ran against me, as though I were a candidate running for office, he talked about how my team and I were characterizing them in this way. In fact, at the very end of the video, he looks right into the camera and says, "And she thinks we're greedy bastards." But we're not. And when this was back in 2014, and when my staff showed it to me, I kind of laughed and said, wow, if I ever write a book, he just gave me the title. And of course, the subtitle of this is One City's Texas-Sized Struggle to Avoid a Financial Crisis. And that really was the impetus for working on the issues. And it came to light, especially during the Great Recession. So as a growing city, and San Antonio was, like Frisco, one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country, our revenue was less year over year, and I did not recommend increasing taxes. In fact, during my tenure, I recommended lowering the property tax rate 4 times, and the council approved that. But the civilians furloughed, and we were cutting back, but the police and fire had collective bargaining, and they wouldn't participate in that. And so we had to keep paying these amounts, and the public safety budget for both police and fire grew to nearly 70% of the general fund budget. And so we had to make reductions then in street maintenance and park maintenance and senior centers and our libraries and animal care and picking up stray animals in the community and street lighting, and just everything else. We had to make those reductions. And so I was learning more about their collective bargaining agreements that actually had existed since 1988, these excessive, by any metric, contracts, and did a lot of research about it and concluded that we would need to address this at some point. I did not think I would be city manager of San Antonio for 14 years, and when we decided to take this on, it was after we had established credibility in the community. That is, we demonstrated that we could make change, development services, for example, the one-stop center where you get building permits and inspections and site plan reviews was considered the last stop, the final stop. And the development community and business community thought it wasn't functioning well, and so we turned that around through a combined effort of changing. I removed the director and put in someone new when we had citizens helping us with what needed to be done. So we demonstrated, and slowly, by incrementally, that checklist of here are all the things we need to do, developed a big bond program, something 4 times larger than the city had ever done. In the 15 years before I was city manager, you saw in the book, you didn't see, but you heard about it, that they had done about 4 bond programs, 3 or 4 totaling $340 million. That's nothing to laugh at. That's a lot of money, but I came from a city where we did billion-dollar bond programs, every 5 years, and a new city. And here you have San Antonio, over 500 square miles, 4,000 plus miles of streets. As an old marathon runner, I'd go out in different parts of the city to learn the city when I first moved there, and it was obvious that they needed better street construction, needed more sidewalks. There was a lot of work to do. So we developed a big program and implemented the first one within the 5 years, and completed projects from the previous bond programs that I inherited that hadn't even been started. Assembled a great team. I reorganized the staff to do that. So doing these other foundational things was very important, and I wouldn't have been able to take on this issue if we hadn't developed credibility within the community that we knew what we were doing, we had the support of the mayor and council, and had the data to support what really needed to be done. So it was tough to take this on, but I started early with the mayor and council and the community. So when I would present the annual budget, even beginning back in, my staff remind me, back in 2011, 2012, I started showing them the trajectory of public safety spending and where that was going based on revenue, 10-year history of revenue projections, and then their expenses. And it showed that by the year 2031, public safety would consume 100% of the general fund budget. There wouldn't be anything else. Now, would we let that happen as a community? Of course not. But why wait for the crisis? Let's try to address that incrementally. And so The council bought into that. Mayor Castro, Julian Castro, was mayor. Now I'm on my second mayor at this point. And working with him, we presented a business plan that is, here's our business case to address this. And he said, okay, I support that. Not in the first meeting, by the way. We had several meetings to go over this. And he said, but I want you, city manager, to be out front on this, and I'll keep the votes together on council, because we knew, and we talked about it, this would be a very tough thing to do, that we'd have a lot of opposition from the unions, both unions. And that was great. He did keep the council together, and then he left to join the Obama administration. I had another mayor, and she was very supportive of what we were doing, but wanted a different approach, wanted to, in her words, play nice in the sandbox. And they weren't, in the end, very nice to her either. And so it was a very difficult process. But I will say, the one thing that we did, and when the mayor asked me, if you're going to take this on, what do you think how should we go about it? And I recommended a committee, because back in 1988, when Mayor Henry Cisneros was mayor, he wanted to build the Alamo Dome. And maybe some of you have been to the Alamo Dome for high school football championships or other activities when you're in San Antonio, or conferences. And they had to do a sales tax increase to build it. And of course, the police and fire unions wanted that money for police and fire. And to keep them at bay, they gave them these excessive contracts back in 1988. So when I went to San Antonio, and I didn't go to San Antonio to become a public safety villain, I didn't even know those contracts really existed to the extent that they did. But they were very excessive. Free health care with no premiums for public safety employees as employees and through retirement. A legal fund that paid for divorces, child custody disputes, criminal defense for DUIs and domestic violence for they and their family members, unlimited tuition reimbursement, and I'm an advocate for tuition reimbursement, job-related. We had firefighters and police officers getting economics degrees and then going off to work for financial service companies in San Antonio, or law degrees from St. Mary's University, we'd reimburse $20,000 a year for law expenses. Anyone who's a lawyer here who paid for their own law degree, I'm sure would say, gosh, I wish I had a law degree. And then in that case, I remember a firefighter who did have a law degree represented firefighters in arbitration against us, the city. And I would think, oh my gosh, we paid for his degree and he's representing the person fighting us. So it was excessive by any metric. And they also had a 10-year evergreen clause to the contracts, so that when it expired, all the terms and conditions continued. And the only thing they didn't get was a cost of living adjustment. In the police case, they had 17 special pays. They were very clever, and every time I would uncover something, my staff would say, why are you surprised? They've had 25 years to create this situation. But what I recommended, because people had forgotten about what had happened in 1988, or younger voters had no idea what had happened back in 1988 or what these contracts represented. Most of us, and I highly regard and I'm grateful for the work of our public safety personnel. I'm very grateful. I've worked with police and fire, I did for 45 years, and the work is hard. It's tough to be a police officer, a firefighter, and they choose to do that work, and yet it is tough. In fact, in San Antonio, we had 10 line-of-duty deaths during my tenure as city manager, 9 police officers, 1 firefighter. And I recall going to the hospital with the chiefs on every one of those and meeting with the family, and it doesn't get much harder than that, right? And so I am grateful for their work. It also has to be affordable to the public, and there has to be accountability. And so what was going on in San Antonio really needed to be remodeled. And I sat down with the union presidents. They really liked me when I first came to San Antonio because we were addressing issues that they were concerned about. And I'd sit down with them and meet with them. And in fact, the fire union president said to me at one point, I think it was my 2nd or 3rd year I was there, and I'd meet with them to say, here's what I'm recommending in the budget before it went public, courtesy. And he said, I'm a soldier without a war. I said, what do you mean? And he said, you're taking care of business. I'm going to have to make up stuff to prove to the troops that I have a purpose. Because in their collective bargaining agreement, he was full-time as the union representative. And he said, and just so you know, he said, I want you to know that I lie. So I'm going to make up stuff.
Oh.
My chief was there, and so I had witnesses to this, but I thought, oh boy, okay, this is not going to go well. So I did when we decided to take this on collectively, my team, the mayor and council, and change these contracts. I sat down with the union presidents and said, here's what we need to do. We're going to have a committee of half of the committee, 12 people on the committee. Half will be union representatives and civilian and uniform, and then half pension and health care experts from the private sector. And the mayor appointed chair people and said, okay, city manager, you're on the committee too. And I said, fine, I'm going to be there anyway, working on this with them all. I thought that if we had a conversation, and we did this 9 months in advance of the contracts expiring, that if we talked about it openly and had a reasonable conversation and looked at the data of how we compared to other cities in the state and also nationally, and the local economy, that we could be reasonable. But they had their heels dug in from the beginning. In fact, there were cameras, like the 2 here today, in those meetings that were only positioned on me during every single meeting. And I'm, as my husband knows, I'm not a good poker player. You can usually tell what I'm thinking about by the expression on my face. And so, but I had to work really hard to not, you know, when they'd say something outrageous like, if you can't afford what we got in 1988 anymore, then just raise taxes. And that was easy for them to say because most of them didn't live in San Antonio. Less than half of the police officers live, even today, less than half live in San Antonio. And it's not an affordability issue. There's all kinds of housing in San Antonio. And only 40% of the firefighters lived in the city. And so I said, no, I'm not going to recommend. We can address this by offering a health savings account and a consumer-driven healthcare plan. We're going to remodel this healthcare because at the time we were spending for the firefighters $20,000 per firefighter annually on healthcare. And when I talk with business groups about this, and beyond the council, I also talked with a lot of community representatives, so they understood why we were going about this. They'd say, oh my gosh, if that were my company, and I'd be bankrupt. And I said, well, that is my point, exactly. We really have to address this. And so taking it on, though, was a non-starter for the unions. They told me that, and they worked really hard to try to convince council members to not support what we were trying to accomplish, and eventually tried to get me fired, but couldn't do that.
So I do want to dive into the playbook. So this was kind of a big aha for me when I was listening to your book, because you ran through, there is literally a playbook for how unions will operate and how they influence and get what they want. And as you were going through the items, I was like, checking the box. That's happening here. That's happening here. That's happening here. And truly, it starts with trying to pit the citizens against their elected officials and against their city manager and city government and try to create a wedge. There's intentionally misleading information. The signs that are all over Frisco right now say Frisco firefighters are really big and association almost illegible, to give the perception that this is the individual members and it's the department, that are requesting these changes. I know you dealt with a lot of aggressive strategies, personal attacks against you, trying to get the community to turn against you. But then the big strategy is politically running union endorsed candidates that becomes this endless cycle where every new election is a new baseline for what they're going to collectively bargain. And so what they negotiated last year, you've got 2 new candidates on the ballot, and they're going to support those 2 new candidates, but it's going to come with an ask. And if they win, then it's back to the negotiating table. And to your point, you do that over a span of 10, 15, 20 years, and you wake up and you're in the position that you were in. So maybe talk about the playbook.
So yeah, I brought a copy, which I'm happy to leave with you all if you want. This one is actually Ron DeLorde, who was the CLEAT director in Texas, the Consolidated Law Enforcement Association executive for years, but he and others published this book called Police Union: Power, Politics, and Confrontation in the 21st Century. And it is a handbook on how to fight City Hall and city managers and mayors and council members who want to change collective bargaining agreements. And they also, in this preface to the book, this is the second edition, the 4 co-authors meet once a year in Las Vegas to train police labor leaders on the principles of building and using power, becoming politically active, and when and how to engage in confrontation. And so I was given this book, of course, when it was part of my research, but I mentioned police, since this focuses on police, because our police and fire in San Antonio have collective bargaining. It was voted on back in the 1970s, and I did the research on that as well. For those, they were 2 separate special elections. Less than 8,000 people voted in each of those elections to give them collective bargaining. And as I said, I'm not anti-union, but what was going on was so excessive in San Antonio, it really needed to be changed. I even talked with my father about this. And they really look at how to, it's a method of intimidation. Now, in San Antonio, the unions had full-time lobbyists that worked the legislature. So they did get an exemption actually, from the city charter so that police and fire could endorse and their PACs could give money to candidates. And so what happened in San Antonio, and I watched this time and again, each time there was an election, they would ask the people who were running to give them what they wanted, or they wouldn't support them. And it was, a bit of blackmail. Support me, or I'm going to run somebody against you. And they had quite a machine. So in this book, it talks about keeping the pressure on, and I'm just going to read you this one thing about keeping the pressure on the council members. The principle is sometimes called the cockroach theory. When you have trapped a cockroach under your shoe, you never, under any circumstances, let the bug up to come back another day. Anytime that the police union is in a fight with the employer, the group must keep coming up with a new tactic that will keep the other side reeling until the union's goal is achieved. One tactic in and of itself will not do the trick. If you stop to let the other side take a breath, it will only prolong your ability to prevail. And so, yeah, they would absolutely do this. In fact, one of the other strategies was to attack any initiatives or new programs that the council was proposing. So there was a streetcar initiative for downtown San Antonio, and the fire union circulated petitions to get that on the ballot, because it was controversial. It was something new. It was light rail, fixed rail to go around the downtown, and they killed it. They killed the initiative, and that's another part of the initiatives, and going after referendum. They tried to do it with our bond programs, but because we had done a good job with the first and the second, we did $2 billion in just GO bonds while I was city manager, and the community loved those, so the police and fire couldn't attack that. But the police and fire had Me Too clauses. I used to joke with the police union president and say, you know, you need to send an invoice to the fire union because you do all the work, and fire would always hang back just to get whatever police got. And I lined up the two contracts so that they expired at the same time and sat down with them and said, first in, best contract. I'm not doing this. Somebody gets something more later. But fire still hung back. Their game plan included political action committees. They became the biggest contributors to city council elections over time. Political tools, they had computer equipment with every registered voter at their, at their union headquarters. They hired political and bargaining consultants to work with them. They joined the Chamber of Commerce to have a seat at the table. They worked on internal membership unity. They started publishing monthly magazines. I mean, that talked about, everything to keep them kind of united and together. They did image building. They started going out in the community and contributing to charities and doing good things. And they'd even occasionally cooperate with city officials on certain things that didn't negatively affect them. But they followed the Saul Alinsky approach, and he was a Chicago civil rights guy who had been a criminologist at the University of Chicago and quit that job back in the 30s to work and help people in the poorer areas of Chicago get better. And his line of thinking, and it's quoted throughout this book, is change comes from power, and power comes from organization. And so the unions had, at their union hall, they'd have more than 100 telephones set up so that they could pull in people to get on the lines and just start calling, because they had all the information about people. And so it was daunting and intimidating to council members. Even our committee that worked on this issue for 6 months published a report. The unions took exception to it, even though the conclusion was their benefits, pay and benefits, were excessive by any metric. They took exception to that, and we started negotiations, but they just had their heels dug in. And I think some of the TV commercials they ran against me were probably film from those sessions where they were, filming a moment where I might have raised my eyebrows or looked tired or, rolled my eyes. Yeah, it was pretty ugly. The first time when they first came out, the business community contacted me and said, "Oh my gosh, have you seen these ads on TV? We have to run our own ads. This is terrible." And this was at the beginning of the process, maybe 2 years into it, and I said, "Nope, nope, that's good money after bad. Just don't look at it. I'm not looking at it. You can't look at it." And as city manager, this was not the only thing I was working on. It probably got a lot of attention in those final years of my work, but I was still city manager of the entire city organization. So I had to keep my head on straight, right? And I didn't want to have that drag me down. And of course, this was during the rise of social media. They had their own website with all kinds of nasty information. Inaccurate information, so we put up our website, and I talked with our tech staff on, we want more hits on ours, so ours rises to the top, and people read ours first, not theirs first, and I mean, we were just chasing our tail, it seemed. I always felt that if I could sit down in groups with the members of the union and talk with them, I think I could have reasoned with them. I really believe I could have. But my attorney said that would be an unfair labor practice, that I couldn't do that but through attorneys. And so we only had to negotiate. It's interesting though, because sometimes and of course I was out in the community all the time, and I would always go out of my way to shake hands with police officers and firefighters, thank them for their work and for being in attendance at whatever the event was. And some would pull me aside and say, "Hey, I understand why you're doing what you're doing, but don't tell the union I said that." And I think even some of them today still recognize. And you know, we did mediate in the end a settlement with the police union. It was court ordered, because they would not continue to negotiate, and so we asked Court of Appeals to order them to mediation. We just in about 5 years of that contract saved the city, as you know from the book, over $100 million just on the changes to healthcare. And so the fire union tried to convince the police union members to vote against it on the ratification vote. They thought that they didn't get enough. I thought we'd given away too much personally as the city manager, but the mayor and council had grown tired of the fight, and so they said, "Let's go ahead and accept this, and we'll make it incremental and get more in the next contract." We tried to mediate with the fire union. They walked away from that, and then decided they were going to go to the voters. So they put they gathered signatures and had 3 initiatives on the ballot. You want me to talk about those?
Yeah, I'm getting a lot of head nods, so
okay.
they're eating it up.
So the first one was a referendum that would give the voters the opportunity to put any decision the council made, like an individual item within our $3.5 billion budget, on the ballot with very few signatures. And so anything the council did could be referred to the ballot with very few signatures, number one. Number two, to limit the tenure of future city managers to 8 years and cap the pay of the city manager. And so in 2005, and this is no secret, it's public information, I was offered $300,000 to come to San Antonio in 2005. And when the recruiter first called me, I gave my usual spiel. I love Phoenix, I'm gonna stay here, I'd like to be the city manager here. And then they said, $300,000. My immediate response was, "Oh my goodness, what's wrong?" I mean, they want to pay someone $300,000 to come to the city, and there was a lot of work to do. So when I did go, they extended my contract 5 times and kept paying me more so that I wouldn't leave. And so in a community like San Antonio, where the median income is about $55,000, very difficult for the general public to relate to anybody with a six-figure salary, right? And so they picked on that. And they didn't want a strong city manager. When I first sat down with them and said, I'd like for you to be a part of this, we'd work together, they said, no, and we'll just wait you out because we have a 10-year evergreen clause and you'll be gone. And I reminded them that I was a marathon runner, not a sprinter. I wasn't going anywhere, and that I really was committed to work on this issue. We had worked so hard to get the organization in great shape financially, organizationally. We'd assembled a great team, and I didn't want to leave that financial legacy of not addressing this issue. No city manager before me had tried to take it on. I can see why now, given what I went through, but I was also approaching the end of my city management career, and so I thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? They fire me. I think my husband was in the background cheering, please fire. But it was, yeah, that was tough. And then the third item on the ballot was a vote for binding arbitration. And, you know, in a right-to-work state, I think that unions, collective bargaining, whether it's meet and confer or it's actual collective bargaining, is not well understood because it's a right-to-work state, right? And so they would campaign because they got an exemption from the city charter that they could. They'd work the polls. They'd hand out coffee. They'd walk people up to the door and say, you know, we haven't had a raise in 5 years. They wouldn't mention that they refused to negotiate for 5 years, but it was only cost of living adjustment. And one of the clever things they had done was keep the base pay low and then have all these special pays. So they'd say, well, look at our base pay, and then look at the base pay in Austin or Houston or Dallas. Look at their base pay. And as I knew what about the special pays, but I said, let's take a look at total compensation. And I actually asked my staff, because they were criticizing me that I had hired executives and paid them more than what executives before me had been paid. We had fewer staff. I think I eliminated in the first 2 years I was there almost 1,200 positions without layoffs, but just we had fewer staff but at a higher skill level. And so I said, I want to see the top 500 highest compensated people in the city organization. And please color code it. Red for firefighters, blue for police, and white for civilians. It was page after page after page, red and blue and red and blue and red and blue. And I even had, to my embarrassment, department heads who were like number 350 on the list of highest compensated because of all the special pays and overtime, and that's not that unusual, you know, that you have workers, you know, maybe command staff that are earning more even than the chief when they have overtime and all of that. But when you have total compensation, I mean, it really visually told a story. So we tried to show this in data. I'm a data-driven person, and it also helped with the city council. Of course, the unions didn't like that I had that chart and that we talked about total compensation, but that's the true cost, right, to the city. So they used a lot of intimidation techniques. This committee that we had, the union members would follow them. Police officers would follow them all the way home. Maybe not pull them over, but just follow them. And I'd have, you know, people would say to me, I support what you're doing. I remember what happened in 1988, but if I am outspoken on this, will they come if I have to call 911, will they show up? And, you know, so people were scared. And I even had a business person call me. He was in an accident on the freeway and said, I've been sitting here for 20 minutes and the police won't show up. Is this because of what you're doing with the unions? I'm like, oh my gosh, no. No, it has nothing to do with that. But, you know, you wonder then what will happen. I mean, they would trail me too, but I lived 3 blocks from City Hall. So, I mean, where was I going? I was going home. I mean, and so we had to be very careful, and council did too. The TV commercials were pretty awful. The rise of social media was a big factor, made it very, very difficult. They organized people to follow social media. So anytime someone would say something positive on our website, they had it organized so that 10 people would attack that and do negative things. It was a pretty difficult time, and you know, I didn't look at all of it. I couldn't, because I wasn't going to let it take me down. In fact, at one point, I remember Mike and I were eating dinner, and I asked him, should I be more worried about this? Everyone's calling me saying, are you okay? Are you okay? And my thinking and my team and I concluded that we had developed a strong plan. It was a very strong plan as to what we wanted to accomplish. And secondly, we had support, not just from the mayor and council, but we had credibility in the community because of the good work we had done in my early years as city manager. They saw the turnaround, so we had support. And I spent a lot of time with community groups, neighborhood groups, chambers, nonprofit organizations, explaining here's the why that we're doing this. And so we had to have that. And then thirdly, it was the right thing to do for the community. Is it the right thing? So I remember repeating that to my staff regularly. We have a solid plan. We have support. It's the right thing to do. And as long as we have those 3 things, we need to stay the course. And now, I remember saying at the beginning, now this is going to be ugly and it'll take a couple of years. It ended up taking 6 years to get to conclusion. But the firefighters after that election supported a candidate against the mayor, to run against the mayor. He had been a council member who had worked for the police union, actually, had done some work for the police union. And I thought one of 2 things would happen. Either they would get him elected in hopes that he could convince a majority of the council to give the fire union what they wanted, or they'd go to binding arbitration, since that was approved. So of the 3 ballot items, the first one, vote on everything, that didn't pass, thank goodness. The pay and tenure for the city manager did pass. It didn't apply to me, but it applies to future city managers. And then the third one, binding arbitration. And because they had campaigned on, we haven't had a raise, the city won't give us a raise, it's been 5 years. And so I sat down with the mayor, the current mayor, Nierenberg, and also the mayor that convinced me to come to San Antonio, Mayor Hardberger, the 2 of them, and said, I'm going to announce my retirement because I think that I've done everything possible. It's out of my hands now. They'll either get this person elected in hopes of getting what they want, or they'll go to binding arbitration, which is also out of my hands. And you have an election in the spring, talking to my mayor, and I don't think you want to be out there campaigning and having them say, well, why is the city manager still getting the pay? And she's been here for 14 years. Why is she still here? Even though it didn't apply to me. I said, you're going to be asked that instead of talking about the issues for the community. You're going to be asked that. He said, no, I can handle it. And I said, I know how ugly this is going to get. And so I thought it was in the best interest of the city that was the moment that I said, I think I should retire, announce my retirement, which I did, and retired the end of April of 2019. The mayor convinced me, would you stay through the legislative session and help us through? And I said, well, I'll stay until you hire someone else. And so I stayed just until April. But the mayor won in a runoff, barely won. And a week later, the firefighters filed for binding arbitration. They ended up getting, the arbitration award came out in February of 2020, just as I was finishing my book. And I waited because I wanted that to be the epilogue to my book, whatever the decision was. And they actually got less than the police union did and less than what they would have received had they bargained with us. They're getting ready to start bargaining again. It's hard for me to believe. I've been retired, it'll be 5 years in April, and they've requested a 33% increase in pay over the next 3 years. Wow. So, among other things. And so, I am grateful for their work. And I admire the work that they do. I attended every police and fire graduation, shook hands with all the new. I recommended and the council approved adding more than 800 new positions, not just filling vacancy, like adding additional, because they were a growing city. It's a core business, but it has to be affordable to the taxpayers, and they have to be held accountable. So it's tough, and you have to have the courage to take it on, because they will fight back, and you can see they have handbooks, and the police and fire follow those rules. I know you also have civil service on the ballot. We too had civil service. I'm not sure what your wording is, but in my case, the civil service situation was that they made recommendations to me, so I could accept or deny. And I would sit down with the Civil Service Commission and talk with them and explain, if I disagreed with them, why I was doing what I was doing. And I think we had mutual respect. We didn't necessarily always agree, but we had mutual respect. But there's a lot of process involved for HR people to go through a civil service process and hearings and representation, all of that. So that was my experience with civil service. But with the unions, it can get out of control. I think back to the days when my dad, was starting out his career, and it was about, working conditions and making sure they had some benefits, for a family of nine of us, my mom and dad, 7 kids. And but what was happening in San Antonio was just excessive by any metric. And I'm quoting one of our committee members who said, whether you compare to the local economy, to the statewide situation of police and fire, or even nationally. And in fact, I was interviewed by the New York Times. Somehow they got a copy of my book and called me and interviewed me twice, did a 2-part series talking about this issue. And I learned a lot from those articles, because I learned that this was happening all over the country. And there were cities that were experiencing this that I wasn't even aware of. And so since my book published, I have spent, at the invitation of many state associations of city managers and other organizations, talking about what our experience was and how we approached what we did, and how we might do it differently again.
Well, speaking of your experience, we call this a community conversation. So what advice would you give the Frisco community, the leaders that are representing this community, but the residents as they contemplate this important issue?
Well, as I said, I'm a data-driven person. So I think understanding the facts and getting to the truth, making sure you understand what is being said, hearing both sides of it, and taking a look at the data itself, number one. Also examining, so who's to gain? What is the problem we're trying to solve here? Is who is gaining here by something like this? And really to think about that very seriously. And then, as I said just a minute ago, having the courage to take this on. If I were to do it over again, now knowing that it took 6 years, I don't know that I would have said the city manager should be the person out front on this. But it's hard for an elected official, especially if they want to be reelected, right, to take this on. But
we understand that.
But one of the valuable lessons I learned from my dad, who was also an elected official in the town that I grew up in Lake County, Indiana, which was kind of the only Democratic county in the state. And he was a Democratic precinct committeeman and ran for office. There was a point where he was running for re-election, and the party said to him, you have to support the slate. And he said, well, I can support these 3, but these other 2, I know from personal experience, I think their ethics are questionable. I cannot support them. And they said, you support the slate or we'll work against you. And he made the decision, he said, I cannot support the slate. And he lost the election. And I remember talking with him and said, Dad, do you regret that? And he said, no. You have to stand behind your own ethics and have the courage to do what you think is right. So courage is a big part of it, and we're all here to do what's best for the community, right? That's why I'm in public service. We want to make communities better. We work as a team, we work ethically, we focus on results, we make communities better. Places where we want people to live. And it takes public safety to do that. But it also, as I said, has to be affordable, and they must be held accountable for their actions. It's not a free-for-all.
No. Well, I think one thing we're trying to articulate to the public is, this is not the city against our firefighters.
Right.
We all love our firefighters. The community loves our firefighters. 2 things can be true at the same time. You can love your firefighters, you can love your fire department, you can view them as our community heroes, and you can also disagree with having a union in your community. So those 2 things can coexist at the same time.
That is true.
Are you okay taking some questions?
Sure.
Do we have any audience questions?
They read the book.
They read the book.
They read the book. First question gets a signed copy.
Oh.
All right, that's yours then. That's yours.
How do you get your position across with coming out against the truth that supposedly everybody loves?
It's a tough one. If I had it to do over, I would have developed a written communication strategy with my public information staff and had it adopted by the council, because
this was 6 years, so I went through, I don't know, 20 different council members during that time, and every time a new person would be elected, they'd say, can't we just settle this? Can't we just get rid of this? Can't we just meet with them and get it settled? And so when all the misinformation is out there, I'd have business people call me and ask, so is this true? And I'd say, no. Well, can you put that in writing for me so I can share it with my business group or neighborhood organization? And I did, and I started accumulating people who then heard that I was putting together kind of an update regularly, like every couple of weeks. Here's what's happening, and here's the truth, from our perspective. But it grew to a list of close to 500 people over time. And I included then the media. Let's send it to the media so they have the actual truth. They aren't going to take the time to sit down with someone. But I had council members, some, who said, the union's upset that you're putting out this information. I said, well, they're putting out negative information about the city, but we can't speak up. And so there were different opinions. Now, this contract in 1988, that they got most of this, that just then was more stuff on top of it over 25 years that I inherited. The police union president at that time had been shot in the line of duty. He was a hero in the department, and he had lots of surgeries and thought they needed better health care. And I'm sure they did back then. I wasn't there in 1988. But what they got was overboard. In this legal fund, they had attorneys who would manage this so they could, when they had child custody disputes. I actually found out about it from a spouse, an ex-wife, who approached me in a meeting and said, every time I want to change my child custody schedule, he tells me just to go to court. And you're paying for him to go to court, but I don't have the money to go to court every time we want to change this. And I was like, what? Is this possible? And then I'd go back and research. Sure enough, yeah, that was the case. And so making sure that information was out there was important. But this Harold Flamia was his name, police union president, was taking kickbacks from the attorneys on referrals, and he got caught. He ended up being indicted, and he went to prison over this legal fund. And thereafter, the city manager was entitled to audit that fund. And so I wanted an audit of the fund. I didn't want to know who was getting divorced. That wasn't the point for me. I wanted to know how much of the money that the city was putting into this fund annually, which was more than $1.5 million a year, how much of it was spent on criminal defense for stuff. And they wouldn't give us the information. And I remember a mayor saying, just stand down. We're not going to force the issue on this. And then when I would bring up that the police union president had gone to prison over this issue, another council member pulled me aside and said, could you not mention that? So it was mixed. I mean, they were getting hit. So it was hard to get the communication out there. But we did it. We had our own social media site with facts, public safety facts, published by the city. We used Nextdoor, some of that just to get some information out. They challenged us on, you can't use city funds to promote, issues like that. I'm like, what do you mean? This is communicating city information. But that was very hard. So what I would have done differently would have been to have
an actual written plan with a strategy and then adopted by the council, so I could fall back on that to say, no, this is the adopted plan, this is what we're going forward with. The council would have to, in a public meeting, not, redo that or deny it, to do away with it. My informal way of doing it wasn't as effective as I think it could have been had we had a formally adopted plan. But then back then, I didn't know it was going to take 6 years to reach conclusion. Both of those union presidents are gone, by the way. They've both left since I left.
You made, I think, 2 key points towards the end. Who's the game and what are we trying to solve? What problem are we trying to solve? We've had meeting after meeting where we're trying to talk to people, talk to the public about what Frisco has done over the years and how we're growing, how we're the place everybody wants to come, the businesses are coming, the people are coming, the school district is great. We're not losing firemen. We don't have a high turnover rate. They have good salaries, they have good benefits. And the question is, what are we trying to solve? One of our city managers, our former city manager, she's been here tonight, said, well, who does the union want us to be like? Do they want us to be like Dallas? Do they want us to be like Austin? Do they want us to be, what city do they want us to be like? When we're rated #1 in so many things. Best places to live, safest city. So what are we trying to solve? What problem are we trying to solve?
Yeah, an excellent question. And even for our firefighters, our fire union, we're the highest compensated in the state. I mean, we had the data to show it. And yet, they're asking for 33% right now. So over the next 3 years, they won't get that, but at least I don't believe they will.
A lot of it, from my standpoint, seems to go back to the treatment of a particular firefighter. We had a situation health-wise and all that stuff that's still, I guess, under consideration and trying to be solved. But you can't make a decision that affects the whole city based upon one person. You have to do what's right for all the cities and all the firefighters and the community for the long term. You can't fix it in one situation.
No.
Do you have a question?
Sir?
So in your case, it sounds like the city manager's office was doing a lot of heavy lifting on that. Here in Frisco, it seems our city manager tries to stay very neutral, which is good, and a lot of heavy lifting is done by PAC. Did you have any kind of PAC that was helping you out, or what was the story of that?
Well, the only vote was the one in November of 2018 when they went to the ballot on the 3 items that I mentioned. The change in the charter for voting on council decisions, the city manager tenure and pay, and binding arbitration. There was a pact for those 3, and I stayed out of that. I wasn't involved in the election. It was a pact to oppose those 3 items. And they raised a lot of money, and 2 of them still passed. And and the fire union worked the polls because they could. And the other thing they did, they had shirts, they have a city uniform, but then they would also have shirts with just slightly different emblems, but it looked like it was the fire department they're helping. They had a tent set up at every, the high voter precincts, and coffee and umbrellas to walk people to the. Well, I'm not sure what your question was on that. Oh yeah, they want it to look like it's the department when it's the association. In fact, I had, at one point, I'll not forget this, a council member tell me, I felt like I was running against the fire department. I said, what do you mean? And he said, he won in a close race, but he said, gosh, they were door knocking, you know, and they had on the shirts that they're not their uniform, but kind of look like their uniform, that the general public wouldn't know the difference, right? And he said it was like I was running against the fire department because he supported what we were doing. So.
Yeah, it's also really challenging right now to get any messaging out other than this issue. Like, you know, the candidates that are running, and I had it in my race last year, you're spending your entire time talking about the fire department and not all the amazing things happening in the community and the big broader vision and what we're trying to build here together. So I know that's really frustrating for candidates just to focus on anything else other than what's going on.
And that happened to us too. During budget season, we would go out into each of the 10 city council districts and hold forums. And we'd have, you know, table discussion where people would talk about what's most important to you, what's least important, you know, what they liked or didn't like about the budget. And we'd gather all that input, provide reports to the council on here's the feedback we got from the community. We'd have hundreds of people attending, but they learned how to work the system. They would come and they would have 2 or 3 of their union members at each of the tables to influence the process. And so then what? Then I've got to have staff at every single table so that, you know, we're truth sayers, you know, we're trying to get the truth out. Yeah, it's hard. And, you know, these phone banks with 100 phones where they can mobilize quickly, they've got the voter registration rolls where they can send messages out, whether it's truthful or not. It's, you know, the Sal Alinsky approach where, you know, power is in organization. And they got to be very organized. In fact, I brought the second edition of this book by Ron Delord. In the first edition, Harold Flamia, the police union president I mentioned, he wrote a chapter in that book. And after he was indicted and went to prison, they removed his chapter from the second edition. So it's not in the second edition. But in the first edition, he talks about how they got started and how they became, their contracts were famous across the country as being the most generous, and how they got that. And and the city manager at the time, who still lives in San Antonio, I talked with him about this, and he said back then in 1988 that he was even told not to bring the budget or finance people to executive session to talk with council about what they were talking about. You know, it was don't confuse me with the facts, I've already made up my mind. And then later, when it came out that the contract cost a whole lot more than what was stated at the time they approved those 1988 contracts, he ended up losing his job. So they blamed it on him. So, as happens, you know, city managers deliver bad news, and elected officials get to cut ribbons and say the good things. And
already in a unionized, you were already dealing with the unions, but there was still, I'm sure, a lot of difficulty in the relationship with the department and the fire department and citizens. Do you have any advice for us as we look at repairing the relationship?
It takes time. I mean, you know, I talk about this in the book. When you keep saying the same thing, the negative thing over and over and over and over, and eventually people start believing that, right? So she's the devil, she's the devil, she's the devil. Well, maybe she is the devil. Maybe this is, she's doing something wrong here. And people are busy. They have their lives, and so they're busy with kids and school and taking care of elder parents or whatever they're worrying about and doing in their own jobs. It's hard to get people to. So it takes time to repair that. Now, in San Antonio, the Charter Commission is looking at rescinding and putting on the ballot this November, rescinding that tenure and the tenure and salary limit for the city manager. I'm not aware of another city in the country that has a limit on how long the city manager can serve. And they said, well, you have a contract. And I said, the city council could let me go any council meeting. I'm an at-will employee. They could let me go any week. All they have to is post it appropriately and fire the city manager. So anyway, they're hopefully they'll be able to do that. My successor was one of my deputies. When I went to San Antonio and people ask me, what was your proudest accomplishment? I would say the legacy of really a great team that we built and improved performance of the organization for the community. When I was recruited to San Antonio, the council would not consider anybody inside the organization. They said, no, we want somebody from the outside. They wanted me. So I knew my work was cut out for me, that I'd have to develop some strong successor leadership. And we did executive coaching programs for the executives. We did a first-line supervisory academy. So you know what happens in a work group. The best performer gets picked to be the supervisor, right? But do they know how to handle personnel issues and absences and performance evaluations and all of those things, terminate an employee? That's their buddy they've been working with for 4 years, how to do that. So, and then a mid-management academy, so people understood what the opportunities were throughout the organization and for movement. A women's leadership mentoring group where we'd pair a senior female executive with a junior executive for a 1-year program. We'd have about 40 women in the program each year. And I worked with mentees as well. And the intent was to help them to retain women in the organization, but also to help them advance in the organization and have the skill set they might need. We did a fellowship program. I'd hire 3 MPA grads every year. And at first, we didn't have many applicants the first year I did it. The first year I was in San Antonio, maybe 50 applications. Now it's over 250 for 3 positions, and it's a year paid program where they rotate through the city manager's office, the budget department, and an operating department of their area of interest. And then if they successfully complete the program and there's an opening and an opportunity for them, we keep them, we offer them a position. And we've been able to retain a good percentage of those people inside, and it infused the organization with young, smart talent. These are people, master's degrees from schools in Texas, but across the country. That was helpful. So when I announced my retirement, all 6 of my deputy and assistants applied for my job. Any one of them could have been city manager. They picked one of my deputies to be city manager, Eric Walsh. My other deputy, Peter Zanoni, is now city manager of Corpus Christi. T.C. Broadnex was one of my assistant city managers, the city manager of Dallas. He was just selected as city manager of Austin, so I'll get to see him probably more than he wants to see me.
down there. I'm so proud of him and the work that he's done. We have Penny Post Oak Ferguson as county manager in Johnson County, Kansas, and Jesus is down in Victoria, and then there are smaller cities that assistants have gone to. So, and Carlos Contreras is now the CEO of Goodwill Industries for South Texas. So really great people. But others, you know, because we were developing that successor leadership within the organization. So I'm just really proud of what they've done, and it's good. So I think it takes time to rebuild, but we'll see what happens in this next election if they're able to do the tenure and salary issue on the city manager. They also have an item on the ballot to increase the salaries of city council, so we'll see how that goes, and to go to 4-year terms. Yeah, and perhaps even I don't know that they've decided yet whether they all at once or stagger the terms. I think staggering is better because I had a majority of the council turnover in all but 2 of the elections while I was city manager, and that's hard when you have a majority of the council turnover every 2 years. Whew. It's a lot of education and training. Well, you've been a wonderful audience.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for being so attentive. And good luck to you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was
You're
great.
welcome, Mayor.
Yeah,
Thanks.
very much
Did we
appreciated.
run kind of too